Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Bureau of Business Research webinar for November 2022. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the director of the Bureau of Business Research, and I'll be guiding you through a PowerPoint about a report that I did with Mitch Harrian of the Bureau of Business Research, where we did the Nebraska Space Use Survey, and particularly looking at the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic on, if any, on space use, commercial space use, square footage space use here in Nebraska. I should note that the project was with the Nebraska Business Development Center, which is headquartered at UNO, and it was as part of a grant with the Small Business Administration. So we want to thank them as well. Before I get started, I'll just mention a few things. First of all, there is a chat window, so feel free on this webinar. So feel free to chat with some of the other audience members in the attending the webinar here today. We also have a question and answer window, so I'll be answering questions at the end, but feel free to type your question at the end or even as it occurs to you during the webinar, and we'll be sure to answer it at that point. We're also going to post a link to the report in the chat room. So, and I don't think I said this, but we sure appreciate you attending the webinar today as well. So with those things said, I'm going to go ahead and get started again, presenting our report, which I did with Mitch Harrian, who is a project director here at the Bureau of Business Research. Just a brief outline. We'll talk a little bit about the survey, but then get to the results. Focus on the results. But us college professors always like to talk about our methodology a little bit, so I'll tell you about the survey instrument or the survey that we did as well. We surveyed approximately 1,600 Nebraska businesses in the following commercial industries: finance, which of course includes banking, but also things like real estate, insurance, as well as other industries; information, professional and technical services. That includes a lot of your like law firms or IT service providers, information technology service providers. It could include accounting firms, engineering firms, other types of consulting firms. So a lot of high-wage employers in that group. Business services, sort of other business services besides professional and technical. It could include services to buildings and so forth. And then educational support services, which is sort of the private sector part of education. So this wouldn't include public schools and so forth. So that's what we did include in our survey. Topics in the survey included, some basic business demographics. How many people work there? Do the business own their own building? That becomes pertinent for when you think about changes in space use. And of course, besides those basics, we were very interested in business opinions about remote work and in-person work. This survey is partly about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, one of those was businesses considering, and in some case, implementing more remote work. Finally, we asked people about their space needs and how they've changed or how they may change in the coming year. The survey was conducted this year fairly recently, so June through September of 2022. We had 2 mailings, so if someone didn't have a chance to fill it out the first time, we gave them another chance, and that certainly helped improve our response rate, the second mailing. We ended up getting 302 return surveys for a response rate of 18.9%. That is certainly not an uncommon response rate for a mail survey done through the postal mail. Obviously we might have hoped for a little bit higher response rate, but that is within the range that you often see in mail surveys, particularly as our survey was several pages long rather than a real short survey. we asked about 2 time periods. The pre-COVID-19 period to the time of the survey. So we would ask people, how have things changed since January and February pre-COVID-19 of 2020, the pre-COVID-19 period? How had they changed between then and the time when they were completing the survey, whether that was June, July, August, or September of 2022. So a little bit more than a 2-year period there. How had things changed about their opinions, about their space use, and so forth. And then we also went ahead and asked them, well, what do you expect to change in the next 12 months? So let's get to those findings. Basic business demographics. So if you look at our responses that we received, here's how they break out. About 40% of respondents were small businesses with fewer than 10 employees, sometimes sole proprietors without an employee. And of course, that's representative of the 1,600 businesses that we sampled as well. You can see there were all the way up to 9 responses from businesses with more than 1,000 employees, or 599. 500 to 1,000, we had 8 responses. So responses from a broad range of businesses. Here's one interesting business demographic that we had. This kind of table presents the results of 2 questions. The first question, and you kind of see that on your left, is we asked businesses in those covered industries, do you own your own building? And nearly 58.2%, nearly 60% of businesses did own their own building where their office space was located. Secondly, if they said, yes, we own our own building, we had a follow-up question. That follow-up question is, do you lease space in your building to other businesses? And more than 2/3 said no, they do not lease space. So there's a significant number of respondents that own their own building and do not lease out any space to any other business. Well, a business like that is going to it's going to be challenging to change their square footage of office space. They would have to sell their building. That would be a big step in order to modify the office space that they're using. So keep that in mind when we look at some of the data on the share of businesses that have changed their office space in the last few years. There are some barriers to people doing it, even if they're contemplating it. And even if businesses don't own their own building, they might have a lease that they're in the middle of that it's difficult to break and so forth, and a lot of incentive to stay in the lease till its completion. So there were some barriers limiting how much latitude businesses had to change their office space. Wanted to point that out again before we got into some of our other results. So let's talk about the opinions that we asked about and received from our respondents. Business owners or managers were asked a number of questions. Has your level of comfort with remote work changed since before the pandemic? So do you feel differently about remote work in June through September of 22 than you did back in January and February of 2020 before the pandemic began to impact the economy so much? Second, we asked, do you feel like in-person work is vital to your company's operations? And we asked that for right now when they were answering the survey and in the future. We also asked, is it important to maintain space for remote workers? So some workers are hybrid. They come in regularly some days of the week, work at home others. Even workers that are quote unquote fully remote may have occasions now and then where they do need to come into the office for half a day or for meetings and so forth. So, how did businesses feel? How critical do they think it was to maintain space for remote workers that they may have, if they had any remote workers? And then there's how you feel about it. You may feel it's important, you may feel it's not important, but what did you actually do? Is such space maintained? So we had a question about that as well. So let me go through what we found for our business opinions. Here we show business opinions on the issue of whether there was a change in comfort with remote work since before the pandemic began to June through September of 2022. And it was interesting in this case to present results for what we called the metro areas, which really meant the larger metropolitan areas of Nebraska, Lincoln and Omaha. And then we also presented results in blue for non-metro and small metro Nebraska. So all our non-metro counties plus smaller metropolitan areas like Grand Island or the Nebraska counties in the Sioux City metropolitan area. And you can see there's a little bit of a difference there, but there's also a consistent pattern. So it's clearest for the metro areas. You can see that more than a third of businesses, 35.2%, said that since the pandemic began, they've become more comfortable with remote work. So they may have had for a period to offer a remote work option to their employees, or they may know of other businesses that had to do that and had a chance to talk to those owners or managers. And through that whole process, they may have become more comfortable with remote work. You can see 12.1% of those metro area businesses became less comfortable with allowing remote work during the period. So they may have had to have workers remote for a short period, and they may have found it didn't work well for their business. And so, they had thought about the idea, but comparing what they thought about it to the actual experience they had, they've become less comfortable with allowing remote work. But you can see, at least in the metro areas, the larger ones, Lincoln and Omaha areas, there's about 3 businesses that say they become more comfortable for each business that said they've become less comfortable. So a growing comfort overall with remote work among business owners and managers. Now in small metro and non-metro areas, it's a little more even, but nonetheless, more businesses indicating they've become more comfortable with remote work, and then there were businesses indicating they've become less comfortable. So I guess workers out there in the Nebraska economy that are interested in remote work, it may be that employers are a little more open to it than they were 2.5 years ago, or gee, it's nearly 3 years ago now, before the COVID-19 pandemic. But regardless of their comfort with remote work, there's still a lot of businesses, the vast majority of businesses, that do feel that in-person work is vital to their company. So they may be willing to consider remote work, but they're not going fully remote. They think in-person work is critical as well. So we pose the question, is in-person work vital to your company's operation? We had one question about whether it was vital today, another question about whether it would be vital in the future. And you can see only about 10% of businesses disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement and felt that in-person work wasn't vital. Another 10% or so were neutral, but the vast majority, approaching 80% of businesses, agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that in-person work is vital to our company's operations today. And it was also true that nearly 80% of businesses said that in-person work is vital to their company's operations tomorrow. So the commitment is still clearly there among Nebraska businesses in the industries we covered to in-person work, but perhaps they're a little bit more open to remote work, at least in some cases. One other question, I think I talked about this a little bit earlier. We asked them, do you think it's important for your business to have in-person space for remote workers when they do have to come to the office? I don't present those results here, but I do present the results for the follow-up, another question, which is, does your organization actually have in-person space for remote workers? Or do you think that's a good idea to have it? And you can see, once again, maybe about 20% of businesses disagreed with that statement. They don't want, if someone's remote, they don't want to maintain any office space for them. Another 30%, I guess, are neutral, but slightly more than 50% do plan to have agree or strongly agree with the statement that they plan to have in-person space available for remote workers. So that's another, we felt, interesting finding. So businesses are committed to in-person work, but perhaps on balance, they've grown more comfortable with remote work. However, even when they have remote work, they think it's important to maintain office space for those workers. So now we're ready to look at trends in remote work, given these opinions, and then also look at trends in office space use. So let's look at those two things, starting with the remote work. I'm going to present some results for how the number of business, the share, how do I say this? The likelihood of remote work has changed since the pandemic began and how they expect it to change in the next 6 months, and then how office space use has changed since the pandemic began and what they expect for the next 6 months. So let's look at the trends in remote work. It was feasible to summarize this right in the document. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, 89% of businesses said that their workers were entirely full-time working in the office. 6.9% indicated that they had, or the workforce was working kind of split days between remote work and office work. And 3.8% were working fully remote, although maybe they would occasionally come in for a meeting and so forth. So that was the breakdown. Almost 90% of workers full-time in the office, and 10%, a little more than 10%, in some type of remote work arrangement. Now let's look at the second column for currently. So this is during the June-September 2022 period when businesses were completing the survey. You can see that it's still true that the vast majority of workers are still in the office, a little bit more than 80%. However, the number of remote workers has certainly grown. So it grew, if you add those last two rows, people who are split or fully remote, it grew from 10.7% all the way up to 16.5%. So it's true that most workers are still full-time in the office. On the other hand, the share of remote workers has increased by 50%. So it's very consistent with the business opinions we saw earlier, in the sense that remote work is becoming more common. Business owners and managers are more comfortable with remote work, and it did become much more common from before the pandemic to now. But it's still true that most workers are full-time in the office, consistent with the statements our respondents made about how it was important to have in-person workers. One other interesting finding from these remote work trends is if you compare the current situation with the next 12 months, you'll notice there's almost no difference, 83.5% versus 83.2%. That the businesses expect will be full-time in the office. Not really much of a change in either the split work arrangement or the remote work arrangement. Obviously, the numbers are slightly different, but they're really within the margin of error of the survey, so it's hard to conclude that much is going to change in the next 12 months. So according to the expectation of employers, they don't think the share of remote workers is going to change much in the next 12 months. So we had a big change, but we may have reached kind of a new normal where 5 of 6 workers in these Nebraska industries are full-time in the office and 1/6 are remote. That may not change in the future unless some other factor comes along to change it. Okay, frequency of a change in office use space since the pandemic. So first thing you notice from this, again, this is comparing pre-pandemic back in early 2020 to June through September of 2022 when businesses were completing the surveys. And the first thing that jumps out at you is that nearly 90% of businesses did not change their square footage. And we presented some data about that earlier, right? A lot of people own their own building, don't lease any space to other businesses. So it'd be kind of arduous to change their amount of office space. They'd have to sell their building or sell part of their building or something of that nature. So, and then even businesses that are renting from others, they might be in the middle of a lease too. So it's perhaps not surprising that there were so many businesses not changing their square footage. The last reason, and probably the primary reason, is a lot of businesses didn't want to change their square footage despite the pandemic, but some did. So let's look at that. You can see, we had some different categories: a small change up to 10% increase, 10 to 50%, more than a 50% increase in your office space. You add all that together, you had about 7.3% of businesses increase their office space. Likewise, about 3.7% of businesses reduce their office space. So it was almost a 2-to-1 ratio, that it was more common after the pandemic, in the years during and after the pandemic, it was more common for Nebraska businesses in these industries to expand their office space than decrease it. So obviously there's cases of businesses that reduce their office space in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. There may be particular areas or parts of town where that was more common, like maybe downtown office space in some cases. But broadly speaking, there was no big reduction in the square footage of office space among these service businesses following the pandemic. We also asked about the next 12 months, and I think that yielded an interesting result as well. So do you expect to change office space in the next 12 months? Well, again, the vast majority of businesses, 86.4%, don't expect to change. Again, probably most of those don't want to change. But even if they were thinking about it, they might be in the middle of a lease for the next 12 months, or they don't want to sell their building. So there's a number of factors that would cause a business not to plan to change, not to expect to change their square footage. But some will. You can see from the results here that I think if I do the math, 10.6% of businesses expect to increase their office space in the next 12 months, and just 3% of businesses expect to decrease it. So now we're at 3-to-1, 3 businesses increasing office space for each one reducing it, or a little more than 3-to-1 actually, 3.5-to-1, I suppose. So that's even bigger than the ratio we saw in the period since the pandemic. So that maybe provides a little hint that the pandemic did affect office use space. If we can count the next 12 months as a normal year, and there's a case for doing that. Obviously, there's some caution. Maybe the next 12 months are still being affected by the pandemic. Unfortunately, we did not do a survey for the 12-month period before the pandemic. That's what I would really like to compare to. But this next 12 months maybe represents more of a normal year. So I think the comparison is still interesting. So during the next 12 months, 3 to 3.5-to-1 in terms of expanding office space. The 2-year period during and after the pandemic, it was only about 2-to-1. So maybe there's some light evidence that the pandemic did impact the space use of businesses somewhat. But again, I think it's clear it was not a wholesale large impact. And I think that's the key takeaway. So I guess if I was to sum things up, business managers have become more comfortable with the possibility of remote work on balance. And they even maintain some office space for those remote workers. However, overwhelmingly, the businesses indicated that in-person office space is still vital for their business and will continue to be so. So you can almost say that businesses, owners and managers have been more comfortable with remote work, but they're still largely seeking in-person workers. And I I think maybe that's nice in a way that Nebraska workers have more options. If someone is really committed to finding a remote work opportunity, there's 50% more of those opportunities out there. But there's also lots of opportunities for people who prefer to work in the office as well. Unsurprisingly, given this desire to maintain remote work, we didn't see, to maintain in-person work among their employees, we didn't see a widespread drop in office use, even as remote work became 50% more common, although it, from 10% to 11% to 16%, so still not a huge part of the workforce. And again, that might partly be happening. This last one's a bit of a caveat. Maybe part of the reason we don't see a change is businesses own their building, don't rent out space, so it's very difficult for them to adjust their amount of office space. But it's certainly also plausible that the lack of change in office space use is primarily due to the preferences of employers and how those have changed. So that's the big takeaway that we saw, that clearly things have changed somewhat. There's more remote work, but there was no wholesale large impact on commercial office space in these key service industries that we studied. So that was our main result. And if people would like to type in a question, now's a good time to do that. While you're typing away, I'll mention a few other things. First of all, we have an upcoming webinar here on December 9th, where we'll present the Nebraska Economic Forecast. So Mitch Harry and I are members of the Nebraska Business Forecast Council, which is just a group of academics and people from researchers from utilities, and a few economists from utilities, and a few economists from the state of Nebraska. And we do a forecast every year for the economy. And we'll present the results of that at our webinar on December 9th. So looking forward to getting a chance to do that. I see there's a question in. Is there any data broken down to Omaha and Lincoln's downtown, whether their attitudes and practices were normally different? So that was the question that was asked. That's a good question. We were pretty happy with our response rate, certainly our response number, since we surveyed so many businesses. We got 300 approximate responses. It became a little more challenging if we broke down and looked at subsectors of our respondents. It became a little more challenging just because we didn't have a large enough number of responses, so we weren't able to break things down for the downtown versus the rest of the community. And I tried to emphasize this, or at least mention it in the presentation, that while these are the results for business locations in general in Nebraska, there could be pockets of areas like downtown areas where there's been a bigger change in office space, where attitudes, the pattern of business attitudes is different. So I'm sorry I don't have that information. I'll mention one last thing. In addition to our upcoming webinar, you can follow the Bureau of Business Research's reports and so forth, such as this one. We have a monthly leading economic indicator report. You saw the forecast. You can follow those on a number of social media, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, to the web, and so forth. So there's how to do that. And if you send us an email at bbr@unl.edu, we'll put you on our emailing list, where we'll give you emails with links to the reports as they come out. So please consider that. Sure appreciate you participating as audience members in our webinar today. And we look forward to upcoming webinars here in December, and then of course in the spring semester. So thank you again for your time.